hopefully share it. There's no secret information here. It's all to be shared, and I'd encourage you to do that. And most importantly, please post your questions in the chat section, and then we'll take some live questions at the end as well. So I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. David, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that, if that's coming across? Great, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about sports concussion programs and in schools in particular. And I'm going to talk to some of the new paradigms which we've been implementing in the last 2 years and some of the partnerships we've established. I've introduced some of the people who have contributed to this presentation and also to the program, and I'd encourage you to ask questions beyond just me and to interrogate what we're doing in sports concussion with a lot of the brains that we have on the meeting today. These are important disclosures of mine. These are some of the areas that I'm involved in sport-related concussion, nationally and internationally. And I've tried to bring some of this experience over the years into schools programs. Important that I declare that I have a relationship with NeuroFlex in that they have, for the last 2 years, assisted in subsidizing our school's concussion program, but I have no commercial interest in NeuroFlex. In other words, I don't make any money from their product at all. I think it's important to acknowledge that times have changed, and we have to look no further than the cell phone and how much we can do on the phone now compared to when these first came out. And probably the area that's changed more than any other in sports medicine and possibly even medicine is our understanding of concussion. And many of you have probably seen this meme which has come through on various emails and WhatsApps in terms of, how concussion used to be managed and probably glossed over in the past, and how the prominence of concussion and adequate concussion management has now changed and come to the fore. When I started as a young team doctor in 1995, probably the area that worried me most was sports concussion. I knew I had lots to learn in various areas of the game, but I'd much more rather be treating a knee injury than I would a head injury in those days, because we were very much out at sea, not knowing exactly what we were dealing with and how it was best to be managed. And we certainly had no science informing our decisions. And I asked myself 2 questions back in 1995. The first was, what are the most appropriate protocols available to manage sport-related concussion? And the second was, because I was dealing with a lot of school athletes, how can we make these protocols available to school athletes? And those are 2 questions that I still ask myself today. And hopefully we'll go some way to answering them during the presentation. Earlier this year, I put together a presentation for the neuropsychology sports group in North America, and I looked at the evolution of sports concussion and the contribution of neuropsychologists, and I've included some of that in today's talk. And I called that Ball Sports Brains and Braving Change, because that sort of summarizes what's happened over the last 25 years or so in terms of what we've learned from collision ball sports, how we've had to put many brains together to solve these issues, and how some brave decisions have had to be made that have changed the trajectory of concussion management. And we're going to talk a lot about how collision ball sports have changed care, and in a South African context, of course, looking at rugby in particular. These are the main themes of today's presentation. So we're going to look at each of these, quite a detailed presentation. And what I'm going to do is summarize it as we go through each stage. But essentially, we want to leave today's presentation with an understanding of what concussion is and what's happening in a concussed brain, how we used to assess concussions and how we do so now. We're going to talk to some important contributors to this field: Boxsmart and South African Rugby, Sports Concussion South Africa, and the Concussion in Sports Group. Very importantly, we're going to talk about the clinical tools, what you as clinicians should be using to assess concussed athletes. I'm going to mention the issue and discuss the issue of baseline testing and where we think we are today with that. We're going to rely on David Stevens' understanding of science, neuroscience, and his experience to discuss vestibular ocular motor testing and its role in assessments. And then in answering our questions about professionals, we're actually going to look at what the Springboks do in managing concussion and how we can implement that. And we're going to talk a little bit about treating concussions as well. So why all the fuss about concussions? I'm going to put out a few reasons, 4 reasons. There are many more, but 4 important reasons why concussion management is so important, particularly in schools. The first is that it's common. So you can look up in the scientific literature the incidence across various sports and you'll get all sorts of figures, but essentially it's one of the most common sports injuries, if not the most common in collision sports. Ross Tucker, who's the head sports scientist at World Rugby, summarizes it very succinctly, and he says that in every 4 rugby matches, there are 3 concussions. So nearly a concussion a game, which in itself is important, that as clinicians we know how to manage it. It's a common injury. The second is that we're dealing with children and children in a learning environment and children whose lives, of course, are precious. And there was a stage, I would say, 15 years ago, in fact, I remember 2009, where in South Africa, children were not infrequently dying from concussions that weren't recognized or weren't managed correctly. And that regularly made the headlines. I remember 3 in 1 year. And I actually thought we were through this stage. And about an hour and a half ago, Clint Reedhead from SA Rugby sent me a very, very tragic story from this week where there was a death of a young schoolboy rugby player as a result of suspected concussions which either weren't identified or managed correctly. And these stories really bring a very stark reality to the fore, and that is that if we do not recognize concussions and we don't manage them appropriately, and we put players back on the field that shouldn't be there, they can die. And it's an unfortunate reality, but a great responsibility for us. The next important reason is the potential long-term effects of repeated concussions, and that's very, very topical at the moment. So it's not only the here and now, we're thinking of how do we manage these players so that their future is not blighted by the effects of concussion. And then very importantly, you'll know that this is a very hot topic. It's a discussion in schools, it's a discussion at clubs, it's a discussion in social media every single day. It has become a huge medical legal issue. And if we don't have an understanding of best practice and in our environments implement best practice, then we are going to have discussions which are irrational, as I believe this article is, and we're not going to be able to contextualize the benefits of contact and collision sport in youth athletes adequately because we haven't looked after these athletes' brains correctly. So I think that provides hopefully some good context as to why we have these serious discussions. So this is the first of my summary slides, and that is that concussion is a potentially serious condition, both acutely and in the long term. And both the medical condition and its high profile internationally require a structured and evidence-based approach at both the professional and community level. And this is what we deal with. So when we see this sort of thing happening, we often wonder, obviously, what's happening in that athlete's brain. our first thought is for the safety of that athlete. And the second is, how do we assess what's happened and how do we manage that athlete moving forward? So this happens to be at an international level, but certainly at a school level, it's equally important. Now, back in 1995, the tools we had available to us were very few and far between. And in fact, all we had available to us was a basic neurological evaluation and a CAT scan, neither of which were really very useful. And so for doctors to make decisions about players was very, very difficult and probably dangerous. So what I did when I was a young doctor was I looked elsewhere for information. And I particularly looked to North America and to American football, which I realized was well-resourced and perhaps had some answers. And in searching the literature back then, and I'm sure you're aware of the differences between American football and rugby, it amounts to about that. But jokes aside, in searching the literature, I came across a series of articles that I thought might point me in the right direction. And many of those spoke to the importance of assessing concussion, the importance of not putting athletes back too soon. And all of those articles had one thing in common. They had this man in the middle here with that brown sweater on as an author. His name is Dr. Bob Cantu, and he was a neurosurgeon at that stage, I think, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Now, Dr. Cantu is now 87 years old, and he's still involved in concussion management, the Concussion in Sports group, and in the NFL's Head, Neck, and Spine Committee. And for many years, he's been a pioneer in trying to lead clinicians to manage concussions better. And when I looked at one of his articles back in the 1990s, this is what he wrote. Unfortunately, there are no universal criteria either for defining concussion or determining when an athlete may safely return to competition. And in a way, it didn't help me, but it made me feel better that at the tip of Africa, I wasn't the only one that had questions about how to manage concussion. But what Dr. Cantu did was quite brave. He said he actually then defined some criteria, and he said, well, let's look at what concussion is and let's try and give some guidance. So what he did is he looked at two of the presentations of concussion, loss of consciousness and amnesia, or loss of memory. And he defined concussion according to that, and he graded it, grades 1, 2, and 3. And he said, well, you know, this is what a mild, moderate, and severe concussion looks like. And he said, well, this is how we should manage them. If it's your first concussion, second or third, mild, moderate, or severe. And he gave us some guidelines in terms of returning to play after 1 week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, etc., depending on the grade and the number of concussions. And this was the first time that we had some guidelines that said, well, this is how you should manage concussion. And this is what we did in the 1990s. But as you can see, it is quite what I would say is blunt. It really doesn't look in depth. And if you look at loss of consciousness of more than 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, these are random figures, really. Amnesia of 30 minutes, more than 24 hours. These were not based on any science, but for the first time, at least, we had a framework to operate in. So in summary, this next summary, I want to again say concussion is a potentially serious condition, acutely and long-term. Yet our approach, even only 20 years ago, was very blunt. And even the initial protocols lacked any scientific basis. So we had a framework, but there was really no science behind it. It was just a clinician, expert opinion type of guidance that we had. And that's what we worked on. So the question I asked is, like Einstein did, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And the question was really, is this too simple? And it really was, but at least it was a framework that we could work within. What is really happening in the concussed brain? And this will hopefully allow us to understand that it's a slightly more complex scenario than Dr. Cantu originally presented. He himself acknowledges that those guidelines were far too simple. If your athlete has a head injury and goes to an emergency room, they will in all likelihood have a CT scan like this, which will in all likelihood be normal. And in many people's minds, even emergency doctors, this is what concussion looks like. We now know that actual concussion and the effects of concussion are at the level of the nerve, the neuron. So what we see is that a signal, typically in normal circumstances, action potential, electrical signal is generated in a nerve. It travels down the nerve with axon to another cell and through a very ordered set of signals generated by what we call neurotransmitters. That signal is transmitted from one nerve to another. It's a very, very ordered process that takes place about 97 billion times a second. Hugely, hugely complex. And we know that when the brain is shaken up in the skull, that the ions, chemicals that transmit those signals are disrupted. And at the level of the nerve, there is a disruption of signaling. And we can't detect that on CT or even reasonably advanced MRI scans. So I think it's important to realize that the concussions that we see present at the level of the nerve. And if we're really honest about it, rather than looking at that simplistic single neuron, it looks something like this. It's a massive network of interactions between nerves in different parts of the body. So it's a very complex process that's disrupted and is very difficult to summarize in just two symptoms, loss of consciousness and amnesia. There's much more to it. And what we noticed when we started following the literature through the early 2000s is that there was a change. There were contributors to the literature beyond neurologists and neurosurgeons. And those contributions came from a group of clinicians, at that stage I hadn't heard of, called neuropsychologists. And neuropsychology is a branch of psychology that looks at how injuries and illnesses of the brain affect cognition, thinking, and behavioral functions. And what this very clever group of clinicians did was they taught us how to evaluate brain function. So before we looked at brain structure and tried to identify injury, but for the first time they were saying, no, if you're going to look at how the nerve has been disrupted in different areas of the brain, you have to assess brain function. And in no more important area than sport did this come to the fore, to the extent that in North America they established a sports neuropsychology society, which looked at the application of neuropsychology or brain function science in sport. And they gave us a lot of new insights. And I started integrating that in a very crude way in my clinical assessments in the early 2000s, using a pencil and paper test called the digital symbol substitution test, where we gave players a piece of paper where each number from 1 to 9 was allocated a symbol, and they worked through a random set of numbers as quickly as possible, allocating that symbol. And we could do this in a pre-season uninjured state, what we would call a baseline test, and then we would test them again after a suspected concussion. But this was the first interaction I had with brain function testing, very crude neuropsychology. Neuropsychologists operate in a different world, a very complex world of evaluating brain function, and they have several evidence-based tests with a lot of science behind them that they've used for decades and now in some ways are integrated into sport. And they did this very cleverly through computerized platforms, and you will recognize some of these. And what they did was they took some of these tests or aspects of the tests and they integrated them into brain function tests or neurocognitive tests that taught us a little bit about athletes' function, memory, reaction times, that sort of thing. and they packaged them into these accessible computerized tests that even people like me could understand. And those really became the bread and butter, because what they did were very cleverly was that they took a wound or an injury which was until then invisible, and like we can identify a cruciate ligament injury, they made brain function changes now visible by printing them out on a report. So we could see a before and an after. So they made the invisible wound of concussion now visible, which was a huge breakthrough for us and something we grasped with both hands. And it was probably an inflection point in concussion management, is the ability to test brain function and have that accessible on computerized platforms. I then went back to North America and I looked at how these were being implemented, and I found that neuropsychologists were playing a huge role in managing concussion. I spent some time at the Pittsburgh Steelers, where I met Mark Lovell, who designed the Impact platform. And I came home and I found who I thought was the most experienced neuropsychologist where I was based in Johannesburg, this gentleman called Digby Orman Brown, who I still work with. And we started working closely together on managing concussion protocols now that we had this new science of neuropsychology available to us. The platform which we ultimately used and which South African Rugby adopted as well was called Cogstate Sport, later became CogSport. And we integrated this into our schools program, and we used to do what we call baseline testing. We're going to schools and do the test at the beginning of the year on school athletes, and then after a suspected concussion, they used to come into our rooms and we used to retest them. And based on these tests, we made our decisions. So it seemed now very simple. You had a test that you could do at one time during the year to check what normal function was. And after an injury, you retested, compared the results, and made decisions about whether they were ready to return to play. A simple and understandable process, apparently. So let's just go back a little bit and recap. Okay, just so we don't get too lost in a lot of the slides that are being presented. So we've got this serious injury called concussion, which 20 years ago, really, we didn't have a clue how to manage. We had some initial guidelines which were not scientific based. And then this group of neuropsychologists came together and said, why don't we package some of our tests into computerized packages which sports people can be tested on? And these tests became readily available, first paper and pencil, and then computerized, and really helped us to understand changes in brain function. So in South Africa, about 2008, when these changes became apparent, we put together this umbrella body called Sports Concussion South Africa. It was really a one-man show initially, which I ran as a website. And it was there as an umbrella body promoting consistent implementation of concussion best practice. We put as much educational material up on the website. We gave a lot of talks, and we implemented a process of baseline testing and after injury reassessments and evaluations. We've evolved that over time through our collaboration with SA Rugby now to have a large doctor referral network, where you can find a doctor that's qualified in concussion management across South Africa. We have about 70 of them now, and they are responsible for implementing best practice, aligning with SA Rugby's practice, implementing 21-day stand-downs, and or the advanced concussion protocols if players get back any sooner than that. This aligned with the timing and the evolution of BoxSmart as an injury intervention program supported by SA Rugby. Those of you that follow rugby, those of you that are coaches and referees will know that BoxSmart is South Africa's national rugby safety program. You may not know that it is a world leader in this space. And that's thanks to the work largely of Dr. Wayne Viljoen and his support team, who still leads the program. And they've evolved hugely, about to release, I think, version 8 of the course, some of which is now online and available widely. And the differentiating factor with BoxSmart is they recognized that coaches and referees were the key people in identifying and initiating injury best practice. If you think about it, very few community rugby teams and sports teams have medics available most of the time, but they all have a coach or a referee available at some stage. So to have the coaches and referees well versed in concussion management is critical. And that applies to all injuries, but obviously we focus on head and neck injuries. And so working with BoxSmart, we've always supported them, and we've always aligned our protocols in terms of injury prevention and injury intervention. And we continue to do so as Sports Concussion South Africa. And each year we reassess our protocols and we make sure that they're aligned with BoxSmart, the research that they've done, and what they consider to be best and pragmatic practice. And so all the information you see on the Sports Concussion South Africa website is aligned with that from BoxSmart. And much of that has been taken up internationally and published in a number of publications, such as the credibility of BoxSmart. So before we even discuss concussion management, technology, testing, any of that, it's very important that schools and any community setting involved in contact and collision sport looks at the BoxSmart criteria and says, what is best practice in terms of managing injuries? That is the starting point for any school, to go and look at the green and gold lists that BoxSmart has and say, what as a community can we do that provides the best environment for managing injuries? That is the starting point as far as we're concerned. So again, just to summarize, we have the serious injury which didn't have great protocols. We had tests that evolved, which allowed us to test for brain function and changes brought to us by the neuropsychologists. And over that period, we packaged the best protocols that we thought were available under Sports Concussion South Africa's banner, and we aligned these with BoxSmart's best practice. And we continue to collaborate, and for us, sticking to BoxSmart protocols, making sure that all coaches and referees are BoxSmart accredited, and ensuring that the best environment available is adhered to is the most critical starting point for all schools. So now that we had the support networks available, BoxSmart, Sports Concussion South Africa, and we were liaising with international groups as to best practice, how could we go to the next step? And that is to integrate these cognitive assessments with clinical evaluation. And what we saw internationally was that there was a big change. It wasn't the neurosurgeons working by themselves with the neurologists and the neuropsychologists in their own silos. What happened? You started to get collaboration internationally to try and look at integrating both clinical assessments and neurocognitive assessments in the evaluation of athletes. And this work was initially published by Michael McRae, who's still part of the Concussion in Sport group and works out of North America in Wisconsin. And he described what we call the standard assessment of concussion, which is still the skeleton of the sports concussion assessment tool. And through the collaboration of neuropsychologists and clinicians, other clinicians, a number of high-impact publications were published. And here you can see the first time that Bob Cantu, who we mentioned, published with neuropsychologists and athletic trainers. So this was really the trend, is that we should be collaborating across disciplines to bring the best protocols to our athletes. So we evolved from 1995, the era of Victus, where we only looked at loss of consciousness and amnesia, to a situation where we had a different definition of concussion that identified functional changes and now had over 22 concussion-related symptoms which we identified. So functional change was the critical element, which leads us to where we are today in terms of a very broad definition of concussion that recognizes the changes that have taken place in the brain through the disruption of that nerve function and what we call a metabolic cascade. I'm not going to go into the science, but just to say that we recognize concussion as a change in function. A lot of this work and collaboration has been led by the Concussion in Sport group, who first met in 2001, and they were represented by a number of sports, including FIFA football, the National Hockey League, ice hockey, International Olympic Committee, and later on, rugby and equestrian joined as well. And what they've come up with, the Concussion in Sports group from 2004, is this protocol that integrates clinical assessment and practical verbal tests of brain function. And what they cleverly did was took some of the best clinical tests available and combined those with some of the neuropsychology-derived tests and formed a protocol called the Sports Concussion Assessment Tool. And that's been our standard ever since. And the basis of that was Mike McRae's standard assessment of concussion. In 2012, I got together with a group of South African rugby doctors, and you'll recognize some of those author names there. Rob Collins took over from me as Lions doctor. Andy Branfield's been a field side rugby doctor for some time. Craig Roberts was the previous Springbok doctor, now the doctor for Chelsea Football Club, and Ryan Kohler is the sports medicine physician now in Australia. And we were all involved with South African rugby at the time. And what we realized was that sports concussion assessment tool was useful, very useful as a field side tool, but we needed more as doctors evaluating athletes in the office in the days and weeks after a concussion. So we proposed this tool called the Sports Concussion Office Assessment Tool, which was quite a crude version that we published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2012. And that we continue to work on, and I'm very proud of the fact that that evolved into an international collaboration to develop what we call the Sports Concussion Office Assessment Tool version 6, which was published in 2023 as part of the concussion consensus process. And essentially, this is a series of tests that doctors do that looks at nearly every aspect of brain function. So where the field side SCAT test takes about 12 minutes, this will probably take about 40 minutes. And it's a very comprehensive evaluation which medical doctors can do that gives us an excellent idea of how that patient has been affected. And that is part of this multidisciplinary group's output, what we call the Concussion in Sports group. This is the group of scientists that wrote the consensus paper in 2023, and a much more broader and widely represented group than we saw in 2001. So I hope you get an understanding that what's happened over the last 20 years is through international and national collaboration. We've developed protocols which doctors can use, which are far more robust than they were before. And part of the reason for that, a very important reason, is that concussion is difficult to diagnose and manage because there's a lot of overlap with other conditions from which sports persons may suffer. So those include really serious things like brain bleeds, headache disorders, seizure disorders, balance issues, pain coming from the neck, and other neurological and psychological conditions. And it's very important to be able to distinguish whether the concussion or other pre-existing or coexisting disorders are responsible, and to be able to monitor that athlete so we don't have the tragedies that we spoke of at the beginning of this talk. So those protocols have been packaged into a series of tools. So these tools, I'm pleased to say, are scientific and clinically evidence-based. Unlike those original tools from Dr. Cantu, these are based on quite robust science. They are also available free. And there are 5 tools available: the concussion recognition tool, which is for non-medically trained individuals, the SCAT and child SCAT for acute less than 72 hours, and then the sports concussion office assessment tool for medical personnel for later evaluation of concussions. Similar to the neurocognitive tests, these have been packaged into excellent apps which are available, and I'd encourage you to look at these. And one of the conditions is that these tools continue to be freely available on these platforms. So there are several of them now, and they are still freely available even in electronic form. And it's something that clinicians should be familiar with. So let's take a step back again and look at this, again, what we've discussed, that potential serious condition of concussion. Initially had a number of blunt protocols which weren't evidence-based. The integration of functional testing helped us considerably, and these were integrated into protocols and advice from Sports Concussion South Africa and BoxSmart, who collaborated. And through international collaborations, including with us in South Africa, clinicians and scientists led by the Concussion in Sports Group have developed now much stronger clinical protocols that are based on science that allow us to diagnose and manage concussion. Again, is it that simple? And we've got to be careful, because a lot of people are taking this information and perhaps packaging it into too much of a simple approach. And so this next couple of slides is really a warning to say, be careful. So there are some applications which are available that promise a quick fix for concussion. I hope over the last 30 minutes or so, one of the messages that's come across is that this has been a process that is far from simple. It is extremely complex, and that there's been considerable work and collaboration gone in to ensuring that assessments are thorough and systematic and multimodal. To think that you can diagnose concussion and manage it from a cell phone app in 36 seconds is irrational and irresponsible. And so I want to put a warning out. If anyone comes and says you can do this quickly by using the app, you should dismiss them or refer them on for discussion with people who know better. I want to talk a little bit about baseline testing, which has been a big part of our protocols for the last 15 years. Just to recap, with the emergence of computerized neurocognitive testing, we had the ability to go into teams, schools in particular, test young athletes at the beginning of a season to find out, in inverted commas, what their normative function was, scores, and then should they suffer a sustain a concussion, we would retest them and compare the scores. Over the last 10 years, there's been some good data published that looks at baseline testing. And increasingly, the findings are suggesting that in the face of the more thorough clinical protocols we have, that baseline testing is less useful. And this paper published this year confirmed that actually having a baseline test doesn't usually change your diagnosis or your management protocol if you're using up-to-date, thorough, multimodal clinical evaluations and complemented by the appropriate technology. So one of the take-homes from today's talk is that I won't be using computerized baseline testing in my protocols in schools from 2026. And I want to spend a few minutes explaining why. The first is what I've just mentioned, that our clinical protocols have evolved considerably, particularly in the last 10 years, to being more robust. In other words, doctors now have much better ideas of evaluating athletes in their office and on the sideline, which give us an idea of what's happening. Also, computerized neuropsychology tests are really one dipstick measure. So they measure one aspect of brain function at one particular time, which, when we had less robust protocols, might have been more useful, but now is less useful. Children's brains are developing quickly, so what you measured in January might not be valid in June. They are evolving very, very quickly. Logistically, and you know this if you've been involved with schools, baseline testing of large numbers is difficult and expensive. And because of various reasons. Some children pitch, others don't. Some end up being baseline and others not. And so we inevitably end up reassessing children who've sustained a concussion who haven't been baseline tested. And over the last 10 years, kids have got very clever. So they've started sandbagging the tests, in other words, falsifying the baseline tests. So they deliberately slow their reaction times, perform poorly on the baseline, so that when they come to the follow-up test, they pass with flying colors. And if that's the only measure you're using, then it becomes invalid. On a more positive note, we have much more sophisticated technology now, which we're going to discuss in a few minutes, that has been developed and better aligns with our clinical protocols. And for the last 2 years, we've actually accumulated over 5,000 sets of normative data in South African children and adolescents. And finally, a continued emphasis on technology for so-called baseline testing opens the door for inappropriate use of inadequate tools. And that's what I was warning about, that people are relying on baseline testing as the means of assessing concussion, and that's inappropriate. So I hope that explains this quite radical change in strategy. Deep breath and a summary of where we've been before: serious condition, blunt protocols, evolution of computerized tests, integration headed by Sports Concussion South Africa and BoxSmart. Further international collaborations developed stronger clinical protocols for medics, and now technology has evolved into platforms that we're going to talk about that still have a very important role to play, but as an adjunct to our more robust clinical protocols. And we should not be fooled by those who try and sell the technology as the only solution. So let's look at those robust multimodal clinical protocols when they're used with technology. And I'm going to hand over to David, but I'm going to introduce him with this slide, which really looks at what we call the oculomotor, vestibulo-oculomotor networks in the brain. And what the take-home message is here is that this is a very extensive and powerful network that inevitably will be affected in most concussions. And if we can tap into it, we can use to measure concussion and also to rehabilitate and actually improve performance. So I'm going to hand over to David to talk to the slides. If everybody except David could turn their speakers off, that would be great, because we're getting some interference coming through, if possible. David, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, John, and thank you everyone for joining. Look, I'll just jump, well, just before I do start, actually, so as John alluded to, I'm the head of medical and research for NeuroFlex. So I've been involved in neurological research for about 15 years now, with a focus on concussion for about the last 10 years. So look, the NeuroFlex platform, which I'll show on the next slide, was actually invented by Emeritus Professor Henrietta Galliana, or Mimi as she's affectionately known. She got her start measuring vestibular and oculomotor function at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology at the Space Research Center, and she literally was measuring the vestibular and oculomotor function of all the Apollo astronauts before and after they went to space, and in some cases walked on the moon. She developed a lifelong love affair and interest in all things vestibular and oculomotor, but felt that the ways in which it was measured back then was very cumbersome and very limiting. And so it was actually very difficult to get these measures. And so she essentially dedicated her career to what she described as democratizing the access and our abilities to measure these reflexes. Next slide, please. So as John showed in this a few slides back, and I was sort of showing here, the cortical pathways on the left involved with the vestibular and oculomotor assessments are extensive and intricate. And like any circuitry, any break to that one, you will show an impairment. And indeed, when you have some form of brain injury, and that can be anything from a concussion to neurological degradation, such as what occurs with Parkinson's disease, we do see impairments in a range of different measures. And so the vestibular and ocular motor assessments are becoming very important for a range of different neurological conditions. The other interesting sort of component that we measure, which indeed has been very difficult up until now, is also the brainstem, which is what essentially your brain sits on. 4 of the 12 cranial nerves are directly involved with vestibular and ocular motor performance. You can add a 5th one there if you include the optic nerve itself. And so the measurement of the vestibular and ocular motor performance done through the NeuroFlex also provides a good indication of brainstem health, which is starting to become very important with the growing concern around subconcussive knocks. They actually believe that it's the brainstem that's sort of copping the brunt of a lot of these forces, and it's the brainstem itself that's actually becoming damaged as well. Next slide, please. To sort of really highlight the importance of the brainstem, I showed this rather simple analogy with a tree. Your brain is like the branches and the brainstem's like the tree trunk. When you damage a branch of a tree, it grows back eventually, just like with, say, for example, stroke. There is strong evidence of neuroplasticity and eventual recovery of a lot of functions. Whereas if you damage the tree trunk, or indeed you damage the brain stem and it's not addressed, often these damages become permanent very quickly. And so this is, again, another reason why the measurement of the vestibular and ocular motor performance is very important, because it does give you an indication of cortical and brainstem health as well. Next slide, please. So the NeuroFlex itself, that was shown in the previous slide, it's essentially just a virtual reality goggles. The patient wears them, and we deliver 8 different assessments. We do smooth pursuit eye tracking, the vestibular ocular reflex, both in the horizontal and vertical planes, pro and anti-saccades, and both the optokinetic and spontaneous nystagmus. Now, for the interest of time, I'll just sort of give a demonstration of 3 of these assessments, but what you see here is essentially what these tests look like. You have the instructions on the screen, very simple instructions. For example, follow the dot with your head and eyes, or look at the dot as quickly as possible. You as the assessor can see the eyes. You can ensure that the person is actually doing the task properly. And ultimately, we deliver these tests very simply, very easily. Now, the importance of having simplistic instructions as well means that for example, look at the dot as quickly as possible. There's only so many ways in which a person can interpret and therefore undertake that task. Therefore, any changes over time is strongly indicative of changes in underlying neurophysiological performance. And therefore, in the context of concussion, and indeed in context of the management of concussion with return to play, this becomes very important, because it does allow the clinician to see those changes and, importantly, hopefully the improvements over time, so that they know that the recovery is occurring, or indeed whether or not there appears to be a lack of improvement, and therefore it may actually need further clinical follow-up. Just quickly, we do get asked about, for example, a learning effect, which indeed John sort of said can be a problem with, say, neuropsychology tests. Our tests are randomized, so the patterns are completely randomized. They're very short duration. There's just simply not that stimulus to learn. And as I've said, ultimately we're testing reflexes. So either your reflexes are intact or they're impaired. Next slide, please. You need to click through them all. Thank you. So look, these are the results. Now, before I ask John to press play, I just sort of want to show you what the screen looks like, just so you can see the simplicity of how we present these results. For example, shown on the screen here is the smooth pursuit head free. This is where the person has to follow a dot with their head and eyes together. We show relevant metrics for that test. So, for example, mean vergence, which is how parallel your eyes are. And we know that ocular vergence changes after a head injury. Vergence standard deviation, so how well a person can focus on the stimuli. Mean error, which is fairly self-explanatory, and mean number of corrective saccades, which is something you do not want to see in a smooth pursuit eye tracking. And in this case, also head contribution, because there's a head movement component. The value in the middle is what that person achieved for that test. And over on the side is the expected ranges as well, for in this case, males 15 to 24. And if I just ask John to press play, please. We'll just click next. What we also provide, and what a lot of clinicians find very useful, is graphical representation of performance. So in this case, blue line's where the person should have looked, and the orange line is where the person did look. And indeed, we can break it down into horizontal and vertical components. Now, this is important because, for example, mean error might fall within your expected normative ranges, or indeed there might be an improvement in mean error from sort of one assessment to another. But these graphical representations indicate if there's any sort of specific area that may in fact still be impaired. For example, they might have issues with their periphery, or indeed their one side maybe is recovering, right? Their left side view is recovering, but their right side isn't. And so these graphs are very important to help provide further granular detail and indeed help provide, I guess, guidance for rehabilitation. Just quickly from a, I guess, logistical and practical perspective, this data is provided, you can access this through just a web browser, so Chrome or Safari. We use Amazon Web Servers to store and analyze the data, and indeed that allows us actually to comply with many countries' requirements for data storage and data sovereignty. Importantly, however, it also means that the data can be accessed anywhere at any time. It means you as a clinician do not necessarily have to run the assessment. You can send off an assistant, a student, for example, and you can be sitting in your practice in your office and be informed the test is finished, and you can access the data almost straight away. So it does open up that ability for essentially telehealth and also case conferencing as well. Just other sort of minor, I guess, important information. So I can go back, John. We do provide, the data can actually be exported into patient management systems or even athlete management systems via APIs. And we can also export the data as a PDF and as a CSV. So sorry, thanks, John. Next slide. We do also have rehabilitation exercises. And I think this is really important because it is allowing clinicians to become very proactive with the management and ensuring recovery from the injury. We currently have 20 exercises, and this is included within the NeuroFlex platform. On the screen, the top picture there is the sort of user interface for all the different tests. On the side there is all the different areas that we can help identify impairments for and therefore provide tests to address these impairments. The bottom left picture is an example of when you click on a test, it provides a preset easy, medium, and difficult. Or indeed, if you wanted to further individualize the rehab, you can actually do that through that little gear lever nut symbol next to the easy, medium, difficult. So for example, here with the smooth pursuit, if someone has, for example, horizontal periphery issues, you can really accentuate the horizontal periphery to allow that person to train and essentially rehab those impairments. Next slide, please. And this here is examples of the different rehabilitation exercises. So I'll just get you to click on the first one, the DNA, please, John. So this test here, you can see eyes on the screen, you can observe it, instructions are on the screen. And what the person needs to do is follow that green dot that is coming and going. So it works on their convergence, divergence, and smooth pursuit eye tracking. But importantly, that spiraling helix, particularly with an immersive VR environment, is meant to, it causes an optokinetic interference, which is a common outcome after concussion. And so this is a very good exercise to help address people who experience that. If you'd like to go to the next video, please, John. This is what we call get the bullets. You've got to look at these little bullets coming towards you. It works on your saccades, your peripheral awareness, and if you allow the head to move, it brings a vestibular and cervicogenic inputs as well. So these tests have like a range, they address a range of different impairments. And because they're gamified, they are actually quite involved, and they do, a lot of the patients do enjoy undertaking this one. And it gives them that sense of that proactivity that they're actually doing something to recover from this condition. If we can skip ahead to the next slide, please. There we go. So look, this is sort of the clinical pathway now, sort of mindful that John has explained why baseline testing is sort of no longer going to be sort of utilised. I do apologise that that was sort of left in there. This was certainly what we were doing previously. As John said, we got very good baseline data from a lot of students. But essentially how the clinical pathway works is when a person has an injury. They come in for the test, they undertake the test, we identify what the impairments are. You then undertake the rehabilitation, training exercises, and after a period of time, be it 1 week, 2 weeks, you then retest, see how that person is progressing, and then you sort of undertake the rehabilitation again. It's really no different to any other form of rehabilitation. It is that iterative process of the initial assessment for the level of impairment, the exercises to help improve from it, and then that sort of essentially that reassessment to see how that impairment is going. Ultimately leading to hopefully that the impairment is no longer present, and therefore any impairments within the vestibular and ocular motor system at least is gone. And so I think that sort of ends my contribution. So thank you, John. Obviously happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, David. I picked up this cartoon, which I think summarizes where I feel I am in modern day concussion, is that I've still got a lot to learn. And the last 5 years have been a great learning experience through interaction with neuroscientists such as David and his team, and it certainly helped. And I'd like to emphasize one thing that David said, is that we're doing everything now for concussion that we've been doing for musculoskeletal injuries for years. So if you think of a hamstring injury, when it occurs, it's diagnosed through clinical assessments and through tests. The injury is treated adequately by clinicians, and then there's a rehabilitation process of strengthening and graduated return to play through a series of exercises and re-exposure to sport-specific protocols. And we've moved a long way in concussion from lying in a dark room for 2 days through to simulating what we do in other sports injuries, which is exactly what we do. What I have realized, that even though we have robust clinical protocols, is that I've probably been missing things through not being able to assess some of the fine detail that David's just spoken to. This is an athlete that I saw 10 days ago, actually played international rugby, and was diagnosed as being recovered from concussion, but it had 7 successive concussions. And when we put him through the clinical protocols and the verbal recall tests and balance, he actually did pretty well. But on his NeuroFlex, he was way out of the norms on some of the parameters which David spoke to. And I actually sent the test results over to David for his interpretation. And I'm not going to go through all the detail, but essentially we realized that this athlete's eyes over years had really not been moving appropriately and working together and sending that information to the brain as they should have. And this was probably responsible for his recurrent concussions. So now, working with his therapist and also utilizing NeuroFlex technology, we will put him on a rehabilitation program to address this, because not only his rugby that we're interested in, but this can potentially affect daily life and careers as well outside of sport. So very important learning curve. Essentially, I think what we've described in the last hour or so is that our clinical tools need to be comprehensive, accessible, and widely used, and that we've actually expanded our toolbox. And that's really an important take-home message. I asked David to emphasize the rehabilitation component, because one of the learnings of concussion in the last 10 years is that it's a treatable injury. We can identify the domains that have been affected, the areas of the brain, and we can actually give exercises to address that. And for that, we need to upskill our therapists, our physios in particular. And there's a number of ways of doing it. There are free courses and apps available. And I would encourage anyone involved in rugby, from a medical support point of view, to complete the World Rugby Player Welfare Passport, and to look at all the different aspects that are available, from field side concussion care through to advanced and intermediate care. They're all available on the Player Welfare website of World Rugby. And then there are some excellent courses which do have a cost attached to them, but not unreasonable, which, if you are a physiotherapist, are absolutely outstanding in terms of upskilling you and improving your ability to assess and rehabilitate concussion. This is a new area which really, I think, if you're involved with school sport, should become part of your bread and butter. And so we're going to start wrapping up, but again, I'm going to summarize. As you can see, this has grown. But essentially, we've now emphasized in the last couple of slides that vestibular ocular technology, science-based, aids in diagnosis, assists in rehabilitation, and may actually improve performance. Concussion is a treatable injury that's used by using skilled physios, complemented by appropriate tools and technology. So back to my original questions. What are the most appropriate protocols available to manage sports-related concussion? I hope we've addressed that. And how can we make these available to schools? So I'm going to ask the question in answering that about what the Springboks do. This is my colleague, Jerome Mpane, the head doctor for the Springboks. Should his players sustain a suspected concussion this evening when they play France, what would he be doing? Well, the first important thing is that everybody associated with the Springbok team is BoxSmart certified. And again, you go back to basics. The head coach, his assistant coaches, all the referees associated with that team are BoxSmart certified. Very important. The second thing is that they're prepared. They don't just react to what happens on the field. They know what's going to happen should something occur. And that's very important for schools. You need to think about your protocols well before the season starts and have everything in place. We've spoken about BoxSmart frameworks. They use what we call the head injury assessment, which is no more than the SCAT-6 assessment, really. It's a SCAT-6 based assessment. Same tools that are freely available to schools. They do repeated evaluations over the first days following the concussion. I'm going to get to the next 2 points a bit later. They use physio-guided rehabilitation. They use exercise and sport-specific interventions, graduated return to play protocols, and they have an independent concussion network that they tap into that gives them independent outside opinions on cases that perhaps are more difficult. And everything in green is available to you as schools. And I would encourage you to put those all in place. The Springboks also now use NeuroFlex, which again is available to you. Again, there's a cost involved, but they are utilizing it for the diagnosis and rehabilitation of their athletes. And they do use baseline testing. And I've put that in brackets because it's not contrary to what I've said. This is a very different environment. We're dealing with professional athletes, only about 40 of them who are in a controlled setting, not hundreds of schoolboys whose brains are changing repeatedly. So the context of baseline testing is very different. But everything else available is available to community and school rugby settings. And here's an example of one of the players who we tested during the year. He's given permission for me to use this. And again, this sort of information that we received through the NeuroFlex was very, very useful in managing this player. The information we got, as David said, is subtle. And I'm certainly not going to recommend that you send every test through to David to assess, but using us as a conduit in Sports Concussion South Africa, we have a global support network which helps with those more difficult cases, and we do see them at schools where they're challenging. And we are there to support you in trying to get these athletes the best care. Here are some resources which are freely available, most of them. You can access our websites, Sports Concussion South Africa and BoxSmart. Encourage you to do the World Rugby modules, which are free. Those Your Brain Health courses are outstanding if you're a physiotherapist. And all the consensus tools and papers are freely available on the BJSM, British Journal of Sports Medicine website, including some webinars. We will also be making this webinar freely available to those who couldn't make it. I'm going to end up with some summary slides. Collision ball sports have brought a focus to sport-related concussion. What we've learned through ball sports and collision sports has been incredible in the last 2 decades. The initial brains behind the key scientific inflections that changed the course of management came from sports neuropsychologists. They contributed hugely to our thinking. Smart scientists beyond the neuropsychologists and clinicians have worked together for 2 decades and braved change in a condition in which the wound was initially invisible. Concussion seemed so much simpler in the 1990s, but unfortunately we had limited tools to diagnose concussion and guide management. In fact, we were guessing. The neuropsychologists opened our eyes to functional testing and introduced computerized platforms which were a game changer, but perhaps made it a little bit too simple. We now have strong integrated multimodal clinical protocols based largely on the work of the Concussion in Sports group. These are free and what we should all be using. Newer technologies are available which measure larger pathways in the brain that complement our clinical assessment, guide intervention, can be used for rehabilitation, and may actually improve performance. The combination of multimodal clinical evaluation and neuroscience is very powerful, and guided intervention post-concussion actually helps heal our athletes. So any school or community program that can simulate what professional teams are doing can do so by being prepared and being box smart, emphasizing injury prevention strategies, educating your players, parents, and coaches, upskilling your doctors and physios, utilizing the free protocols and apps that are available, creating a concussion support team beyond your school, doctors, physios, and trainers in the Sports Concussion South Africa network, and we in turn will tap into the global network, accessing appropriate technology, and I hope you've got a good sense of the complexity that NeuroFlex brings to our assessments, and being part of a national and global network, even from your school sanatorium. So my parting message is exactly the same as that of the Springboks was in the last World Cup, is that if we collaborate and work together as clinicians, coaches, referees, educators, neuroscientists, we're all on the same page, and we can create platforms for your school which really help put a robust concussion protocol in place and support your athletes in participating in contact and collision sport. It's 30 years since the professionalization of rugby. Sport has evolved tremendously. I think we agree over those 3 decades, but so have our clinical concussion protocols. And I hope the last hour has given you some idea of how to do that. And I thank you for your kind attention. I'm overwhelmed that this webinar was actually oversubscribed. And so we will be making this available in a recorded format to those who couldn't make it. Importantly, we've got people who will avail themselves for questions, and we look forward to taking those questions and sharing them with you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think there are some questions that have been posted, which I'll start off by reading, and then if we can handle any questions. Clint, I don't know if you've said you'd monitor the questions. Do you want to fire some of them at us?
John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. That's perfect.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so the only major question at the moment that's come through is just from Darren Edinburgh, just asking, are there any courses available, RE vestibular ocular systems or training? Anything that any advice you can give, John?
Yeah, there absolutely are. Those Your Brain Health courses are available online on the Your Brain Health website. And they also work very closely with teams in South Africa to host live workshops. And Megan Robertson, who's one of the foremost concussion rehabilitation physios based in Johannesburg, has availed herself to give those courses. So if they contact us through Sports Concussion South Africa, send me an email. We can certainly help put them in touch with people, but I would highly recommend those Your Brain Health courses, which are excellent.
Thanks, John. And then also Dr. Wayne Viljoen just posted the appropriate links to log on to the BoxSmart website and the BoxSmart app. And You've heard a lot about it from John today. I encourage everybody, if you haven't already done so, to go and register on the myboxsmart.com site, and see what's available on there, and follow us. John Chris Tomsek wrote, what does this mean for protocols of schools in terms of stringent steps that we need to take in terms of the next step for concussion and appropriate steps to take?
So I think the most important is to get the basics in place. That means to make sure that your team is BoxSmart accredited, that you have the BoxSmart framework in place in terms of what it takes to host contact sports and what medical support you need in place, that you have education for your school community, your coaches, your referees, your parents, teachers, etc. Everybody understands what it's about, and there's a lot of information on both the BoxSmart and Sports Concussion South Africa websites that you can avail to them. And then I think it's very important to make clear what your process is in terms of suspected concussions and head injuries and neck injuries when they occur. In other words, what protocols you have field side, what hospital support you have available, and what ambulance transport you have available in the case of those which are red flagged or potentially more serious, and how those players are followed up. So I think these often need to be customized according to your school, your location, and your resources. And then we can build into that, the potential technology support and where that fits in terms of your school. But I specifically haven't put a template up here because I think it does need to be customized, but those basics apply to everybody. So in essence, if you need guidance as to where your school is positioned in terms of head and neck injury management, I'm happy to have an email, and then we can set up a call to customize that. But it needs to be a process that's thought through now before the new season starts next year.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Before I get to the two NeuroFlex questions, John, there's a comment from one of the listeners. Just so your thoughts on the benefits of clipping concussion incidences, especially that the SuperSport schools film most of the games now, and then using these clips just to sort of get an understanding of maybe the mechanism that caused the concussion. I think that, anything, from my opinion, anything that can help you sort of identify the event and mechanism would help. But your comments, John?
I'm amazed at how commonly this is done, and it helps me hugely as a clinician when someone comes in and they say, we've actually got a clip of the incident, either from the SuperSport Schools website or because a parent has filmed it. I think looking at mechanism of injury can be very, very useful. And then to take it back to BoxSmart principles can help coaches in terms of addressing things like tackle technique, I think is critical. And so anything which gives us information as to how that injury occurred and can be addressed is useful.
Fantastic. Two questions for our NeuroFlex experts. David, Sean, I don't know who's going to answer this. When doing rehab through the NeuroFlex device, does one do exercises to a sub-symptom level or push through symptoms?
So look, I'll answer that one. It is that fine line in terms of the rehab, and indeed any other form of rehab for any other injury. It's that fine line between you want to exacerbate the symptoms enough so that there's essentially an overload, but there's a good overload so that the system can adapt and improve. But you don't want to push them so far that, you basically cause a relapse in their symptoms and they go backwards. So realistically, you'd want to be going to sub-symptom, but as I said, you want to be pushing enough so that there is progress, there is adaptation made, but, as I said, that fine line, you don't push them too far. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
I can add to that a little bit and say, I think, again, being preemptive helps. So to say to the player, you're probably going to feel a little bit worse with these, and that's deliberate. We're pushing you a little bit because we know your brain will make the adaptation. So just setting the expectation helps. The second thing is nothing's going to fall apart. They're not going to suddenly unravel because their symptoms have been provoked a little bit. And if they do, you can stop. But it is a deliberate attempt to raise them. I mean, the Concussion in Sports group, we sort of say no more than 2 out of 10, an increase of 2 out of 10 of the symptoms. I think a guide is also that they should resolve within an hour. So, you know, if they have symptoms that provoke, they should recover within an hour, not have persisting symptoms. Otherwise, perhaps you provoke them a little bit long. But I do think a degree of symptom provocation is part of the strategy, and I agree with David.
Fantastic. Next question comes from Wendy at Hilton College. With the number of kids being on concentration medications like Ritalin and the likes, does that affect the NeuroFlex results?
Look, short answer, yes, it will. So, for example, Ritalin has shown to marginally increase, for example, saccade latency, so how quickly you respond to the saccades. Now, that's not necessarily an issue as long as the medication does not change over the course of the concussion management. So if the student comes in on Ritalin and remains on Ritalin the whole time, then that's always going to have that underlying effect. Where you need to be careful from a clinical perspective is if the person commences a new medication midway through the management, and so that's where the sort of the clinical history and I guess just and ensuring that throughout the management process any changes to those sort of aspects are recorded and taken into account for any decisions, any clinical decisions made.
Thanks, Dave. Just another question, John. I think you could answer this one. Just with regards to the NeuroFlex assessment tool and management tool, can any healthcare provider utilize it, or does it have to be managed by a doctor who is familiar with concussion management?
No, it doesn't have to be implemented by the doctor. I think what's important is familiarity with the tool and familiarity with the protocols. Those are the critical things. So there should be a doctor involved in the process most of the time. I appreciate in some schools that's not always possible, but perhaps remote support is. But in terms of the tool itself, as long as that person is familiar with the tool, has practiced its implementation, and has some medical support available to align the findings of NeuroFlex with the clinical findings, then that's fine. And in fact, it's a great asset that you can actually have some of the stress taken away from the clinician by having someone else implement that test. Now, we've got Julia Williams on the call here, who's a biokineticist exercise therapist who's done probably more tests than anybody in the country for me. And she's been a great asset in terms of implementing those tests. So it can be done by anybody as long as it's within a clinical framework.
Thanks, John. John, basically back to when you were going through the process that schools should follow or how they should set up their systems, we did have a question asked, are there any videos to show how to show the process and how we apply these steps? I suppose just go back and listen to this
webinar
so
I think
again.
the conversation is, that's what we've tried to address here. But I think one of the things we could do is perhaps put one slide together, an organogram, which we could post, which would indicate that, and then on that also include some of the key contacts that are on this call, which I think will help support that process. But essentially, I think that's all included in Boxsmart and Sports Concussion South Africa's advice on the websites. But we could certainly help pull that together into a succinct slide, which I think would help. So I think that's a good comment and something that we can work on.
Hi, sorry, Clint. Can I just
go ahead? Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
Just in terms of also, any other injury that happens on the field, whether it be a shoulder, a knee, a broken rib, or whatever, there is impact that happens then, and the rush to treat the musculoskeletal injury takes precedence. So I think it's also a very handy thing for anyone who gets any sort of injury to have a NeuroFlex just to see if there is any deficit that's been picked up by the impact. And then in a team environment, that player, if it's a sprained ankle, can then be at training and be doing NeuroFlex exercises to keep your eye in, so to speak. So there are other aspects in terms of like high performance or keeping, if you're a goal kicker, a line out thrower. I mean, this is research which is carrying on, but we can get more specific about skills and what happens in the brain to make those skills better.
Can
you,
I
Eddie.
ask Sean Tasker to come in here? Sean, if you put your
Sure.
microphone and camera on, Sean's got extensive experience in schools in Australia, where he's been involved in implementation of protocols and the use of NeuroFlex. Sean, when something new comes in, this new technology, obviously there's a cost involved. It can be quite intimidating in a new environment. Can you talk to your experience in Australia, perhaps, and how NeuroFlex has been integrated into that environment?
Yeah, thanks, John. The integration of NeuroFlex into the Australian schools communities, the good thing about NeuroFlex is it has the relationship with the clinicians that come into the schools. So therefore, if there's a baseline done within the school community or there's not within, say, the school rugby community, that particular clinician who's using NeuroFlex within the rugby boys in those particular programs, they have the understanding of the 21-day protocol. They work really closely with the schools, as you said, John, the parents, the coaches, the young men, the players. So they're well aware of what's going on in that space of the concussion. And if they do have a concussion, there's been a real growth around the openness of the young men when they have been concussed to be more open about being injured in that space. And that relationship with those clinicians works between the school, the clinician, the families, and the young players. And they manage the 21-day gradual return to play protocols. But they will also use the NeuroFlex and also in that space of that 18, 19, 20th day to understand if the young players are not back to what the clinician believes is a normative range or back to a healthy baseline type situation, then they will actually have the discussion around extending their time out of the game to help in their recovery period. Now, that's taken some time to get there, but that's really well received now. And that's been a really big part of player welfare. And what you've found with the boys and girls in the schools is it's not just about getting back on the field, but it's also about getting back and having successes in the classroom. And you'll hear the clinicians talk about, the better data gives them opportunities for better decision making, which then gives them better outputs. So that's been important. I will just quickly add to Eddie's comment around performance. There has been some real good work with NeuroFlex, the pivot away from just concussion, but also looking at what is sport performance and improvement in athletes, individuals in that hand-eye and that coordination space, and that's been really well received as well. Because what Eddie was saying is true. There's many players who have had a sprained ankle, but they've been using NeuroFlex to help with their rehab and their performance, just to give them that edge, find that optimum performance space. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And I want to just add to that and say that if you're struggling to sell robust concussion protocols to your coaches or your school, an important statistic is that if concussions are not adequately identified and treated, you have a 60% increase of potential musculoskeletal injuries. In other words, doing your knee ligaments, your ankles, etc., because of the effects of the concussion on the brain. And that's apart from the increased risk of further concussions. And another comment is that, one of the reasons I transitioned to NeuroFlex over the last 2 years is that it actually appeals to kids. It speaks to their game, the virtual reality thing, the headset. They like it a lot, and it gives them a reason to come in and be evaluated. And the fact that we can actually use it as rehabilitation now will bring them back, because the physios can, if they have a unit in their room, and while they're seeing a patient, they can have the kid on a rehab protocol, which is really useful. And then the performance side of it, to me, is something which really I think will be very useful to explore further and could be of great use to coaches. So I think we're entering an era of a different technology, which not only complements our clinical protocols, but speaks to rehabilitation, performance, and injury prevention in ways we haven't had before. And that, to me, is what's been encouraging, and happy to speak to anyone about my experience with it.
Thanks, John. We do have a couple more questions just from Chris Tomsek. With the schoolboys not doing baseline testing anymore, John, how does this change in terms of the standard measures for return to play for the player?
The standard measures have not changed at all. Instead of, the clinical protocol will be exactly the same in terms of the evaluation, which will be based on the SCAT-6 or SCOTE-6. So those evaluations are the same. The graduated return to exercise and return to learn process is the same as described in the consensus process. And in terms of the NeuroFlex technology, their test result will be compared to norms, of which we have, a huge database now of age-appropriate norms. And interestingly, not only international, South Africanized norms as well, which is critical. The last 2 years, we've accumulated those data and actually fed a lot of information back to NeuroFlex. There was some technical issues, actually, interestingly, about eye shape and skin tone, which affected some of the signaling and which has been addressed based on our South African cohorts, and David will attest to that. It's been a very interesting journey, and certainly the information and the testing we're getting now is quite robust, but the protocols remain the same, that they have to be symptom-free, cleared by a clinician in terms of standard consensus protocol, and if using the technology, have it matching age-appropriate norms.
Thanks, John. And then another question, after being diagnosed with a concussion, when can a patient be allowed to go back to screen time?
So that's very
iPads
individualized. We've moved away from the totally avoid screens at all times after a concussion to, say, limit screens. So, it depends on the symptom presentation, the degree of photosensitivity, but essentially for the first 48 hours, we limit screen time. So we say, don't spend long time, for more than 15 minutes on your phone. Don't watch a lot of TV, watch one program perhaps. Don't spend a long time on your computer. So I'd say from 48 up to 72 hours, we probably limit screens. There's not much benefit shown after that in restricting that. And in fact, it can be the opposite. If you restrict too many activities of daily living, it actually creates a psychologically negative environment for the child. And one needs to, wean them back into normal daily activities as soon as possible.
And then next question, John, if CT scans are not advised for concussion diagnosis, in what instances are CT scans then advised? And I'm assuming that's in a head impact event. So
exactly. So where there's a suspected head injury, which is manifesting with what we call red flags. So red flags would be prolonged loss of consciousness, it would be severe neck pain, it would be deteriorating headaches, worsening levels of consciousness, slurred speech, what we call localizing signs, pain, or loss of function in a limb. Then we need to exclude more serious traumatic brain injury in the forms of bleeds and fractures, and then a CAT scan is indicated. So essentially, if you think your player is bad enough that they can't be stabilized on the side of the field and need to go to hospital, they probably warrant a CAT scan or an MRI. But most cases of concussion don't warrant that. And in fact, we probably discourage exposure to radiation. But if you have a look on the concussion protocols at the red flags, those are what are indications for scanning.
thanks, John. And then I've got a question on the WhatsApp. It's to do with medical professionals involved with concussion diagnosis and management. They want to know your comment around chiropractor involvement in concussion diagnosis and management, especially on-field management or on-field diagnosis and management. Any thoughts?
So my thoughts are that I don't mind any competent person, clinician, managing or identifying a concussion. and that different communities and schools have different resources available. The same guidelines apply to chiropractors as they do to any other clinician. But in terms of further evaluation and return to play decisions, ideally I would like a medical doctor involved in that process. And schools should have at some stage a medical doctor supporting their system.
Thanks, John. That's all the questions we got online and on the WhatsApp group. Back over to you.
Well, I'd like to firstly thank everybody, and secondly, just before we close, ask Clint, Wayne, and the NeuroFlex team if there are any other comments you'd like to make.
I suppose, John, just from my side, just from SA Rugby side, for those on the group that on the call that may not have seen it, SA Rugby put out a
I think you've broken up there,
schoolboy
Clint.
rugby.
Oh, there we are.
Okay, can you hear me now, John?
Can you start that again, Clint? Sorry, you broke up for a second.
Yeah, not a problem. Just SA Rugby put out a position statement this week with regards to instrumented mouthguard use at school rugby or community rugby. And at this stage, there is not enough research and not enough evidence-based information for its practical use at the community game. And therefore, we do not encourage it and we do not endorse it, John. So just wanted everybody on the group to know that. Especially, we're going to get more and more sort of tools coming into the space. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there.
Wayne, you've been quiet. Any comments?
Thanks, John. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for all of that. That was really, really good talk to all those presenting. Just two things. For any medical staff who want to have a look at additional components related to rugby, on the My BoxSmart platform, there's a My BoxSmart medical section, which also covers concussion amongst others, and in the professional game as well as in the amateur game. So people can access all of that content for free, as well as emergency action plans and all the other protocols that need to be put in place. There's also a document repository with all the basic minimum standards and guidance around information that's required to manage the game safely on the ground. And then I've just got one question. Maybe you can address that as well. With the increased risk for musculoskeletal injuries, I mean, some of the research that I was reading this year in preparation for BoxSmart 9 that comes out next year, there's a lot of discussion around that the rehab strategy that's put in place because of the risk of musculoskeletal injury, that one adds a component of prevention for that into your rehab for concussed players. So doing like neuromuscular reactive type training as a preemptive measure to avoid that increased risk of musculoskeletal injury. Is there anything that you'd like to maybe add on that?
I think that's a critically important point, and one of the reasons we like physios involved in this process is that, essentially sport involves an integration of vision, balance, brain interpretation, and musculoskeletal response. And all of those have to be integrated. So it's no good just focusing on ocular rehabilitation or just balance. How that reacts with sport-specific musculoskeletal reactions is critical. So I think as part of the process, having a physio guiding that and integrating with the trainers on the field is very important, not only after a concussion, but before a concussion, to have protocols in place. We know that there are protocols that have been described to diminish the incidence of concussion in schoolboys, and integrating that into part of a pre-thought out program is very important, but certainly after concussion, very beneficial. Anyone else from the NeuroFlex team like to make any comments?
Yeah, just one thing. I see there's a question about township tournaments, and what happens to people, where they may not have a doctor available. It's a difficult thing to address. I have started a sort of a trust on the side, and the problem is building the ecosystem around the team or the players. So I have been testing players at the Lunga Busy Bees and the Girl Power Academy. I've got a pool player, actually South Africa's world champion pool player. I helped her out a little bit as well. But you know, it's the clinical ecosystem that we need to help out the people who can't really afford or don't have the resources around. In Cape Town, you know, we have the Department of Neuroscience, which helps out with a concussion clinic once a month. But you know, they are resources which are, you know, I think we'd all like to improve. So, you know, through BoxSmart, I'm sure as well, Wayne, you know, that's aimed towards it. But yeah, so if anyone does want to get in contact with me about the sort of grassroots programs and ecosystems, they're welcome to.
I certainly think from a rugby tournament point of view, BoxSmart and SA Rugby would support those and help with those guidelines and perhaps even resources. Clint, could you comment on that? I'm sure most accredited tournaments are overseen by your teams.
So John, 100%. All accredited tournaments are overseen by our teams, and we put a wonderful team around it. However, I do see Tando's message, and you know, he's talking about sort of what needs to be at these at sort of tournaments or games in the township. And Tando, all I can say is this, that the guidelines that SA Rugby put out for the minimum standards, we've set them at the lowest level so that anybody can achieve them. So I will contact you after this and set you up with what those minimum guidelines are. But really, at the end of the day, for your tournament, you need a first aider at that event. So that's important. However, if a player then does suffer a concussion, and this goes back to John's comment around the planning. If you're going to have a tournament, you need to plan, okay, well, what is the closest clinic? What medical support do I have at that clinic? What is my closest hospital? Because if you do identify a kid who suffers a concussion, you then need to get them into that structure so they can be seen by a doctor at that clinic or at the closest hospital, so they can be cleared, that that there's nothing serious untoward, and then you follow the process of managing that player through the return to play. So John, I'll get it. You know, that's number one. That I think is, from my side, is the most important thing to follow, is follow the guidelines that SA Rugby puts out and have your plan in place. Know the infrastructure around you.
Planning is critical in those situations.
Sorry,
Wayne?
John, can I just add on to that? I think when you mentioned it early on, because concussion is the invisible injury, I think put it in the context of the township situation. If a player breaks his ankle, what you can do with the player? It's exactly the same concept. Just because you can't see the injury, you've got to treat it with the same respect and get it to the same place you would take the player with a broken ankle. So, you know, if there's an opportunity to get to a clinic where there's only a sister available to have a look and see that there's nothing more sinister that needs to drive the process, that's the type of decision that needs to be in place in those situations.
Great. And then there's a question about the cost of NeuroFlex. I mean, NeuroFlex will support South African schools. There's obviously a cost involved in the equipment and in the support for it. And the South African contact is Eddie, and you know, I'm also happy to talk to you about that and how we can customize it to support, you know, your schools with the technology, and take it offline and discuss those specific costs involved for the NeuroFlex program. So contact me, I'll put you in touch with Eddie and the team, and then if you're interested, your school can take that conversation forward. And as I say, the basics must obviously be in place before that comes, you know, is considered. So I think it's been a good hour and 40 minutes. We've had a great session, and I'm really appreciative of everybody who joined. We were actually oversubscribed for the capacity of the webinar, so that's encouraging. But also, I appreciate some people missed out. So we will summarize this and post it, and maybe even do another one. But certainly, thank you for your consideration. And you know, as BoxSmart, South African Rugby, and Sports Concussion South Africa, we're really committed to supporting your schools and communities, and look forward to this new era of technological support as well at school level. So have a good weekend. Thanks to our Australasian colleagues for joining us after hours on a Saturday, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.